Grandfather handed me a sealed envelope the morning of my college orientation and told me not to open it until I had built something no one could dismantle. He said it with the same quiet certainty he used when he talked about load-bearing walls. My grandfather was a carpenter for 41 years, and he believed that everything worth having had a foundation you could touch with your hands. He was talking about my father. He just never said it out loud. My father, Raymond Calloway, built Calloway custom tile and stone from a pickup truck and a wet saw in our driveway in Knoxville, Tennessee. By the time I was in middle school, his company was laying custom tile in luxury homes across the greater Knoxville metro, contracting for 2 hotel renovation projects a year, and employing 23 people, including my uncle and 2 of my dad's high school friends. It was genuinely impressive. My father had taken something physical and repetitive and turned it into an enterprise, and he wore that fact the way other men wear a championship ring. Permanently. Visibly. As evidence of something settled. My brother, Preston, stepped into that world without hesitation. He was 7 years older than me, and by the time I was paying attention, he was already on job sites on weekends, learning to read blueprints. Learning to talk to general contractors the way my father talked to them, with a specific combination of confidence and deference that kept everybody comfortable and kept the contracts coming. Preston was the plan. I understood that before I understood most things. I was not the plan. What I was, starting at around 14, was obsessed with ceramics. Not tile, not the industrial, repeatable, profitable tile that funded our house and our vacations and my brother's truck. I mean hand-thrown ceramics, the kind where the clay remembers the pressure of your fingers, where no 2 pieces are identical, where the glaze does something unexpected in the kiln, and you either learn to love the surprise or you find a different hobby. I took an elective at school and never came back from it. I spent my afternoons in the art room after the last spell. I saved my birthday money for a second-hand pottery wheel I found on Craigslist and set it up in the corner of the garage, which my father found alternately amusing and mildly insulting, like I was setting up a lemonade stand next to a functioning restaurant. He never said it was stupid. That was not his style. What he said, when he said anything at all, was that it was a nice creative outlet, that a lot of people had hobbies, that the important thing was to have a real skill set to fall back on, and the Calloway family had one of those, and it was sitting right there waiting for me. He said this at the dinner table often. He said it the way you say something you've decided is already true. The conversation that redirected my entire life happened on a Saturday afternoon in March, 2 months before I graduated high school. I had been accepted to the ceramics program at the University of Tennessee, not as a backup, not as an undeclared arts major, but specifically to the ceramics concentration within the art department on a partial merit scholarship based on a portfolio I had spent 4 months assembling. The portfolio included 12 pieces and a 7-page artist statement that my high school art teacher, who had been teaching for 22 years, told me was the strongest student statement she had ever read. I set the acceptance letter on the kitchen counter next to a ceramic bowl I had made the previous weekend. A wide, low-serving bowl with an ash glaze I'd spent 3 firings getting right. The glaze had broken in the heat the way I wanted, grey dissolving into pale green at the edges like watercolour. My father came in from the garage, read the letter, set it down, and looked at the bowl for a long moment. Then he told me he was proud of me. He said the scholarship was a good sign. Then he told me that UT had a strong business program and that if I wanted to study design, interior design was a practical path that connected directly to the construction and renovation industry, which he knew inside and out, and which had a clear professional ceiling I could actually reach. I told him I wanted to study ceramics. He picked up the bowl, he turned it over in his hands, he set it back down and said that hand-thrown pottery was not a career, that it was a saturated market of people with expensive hobbies and Etsy shops, that he had spent 20 years building something real, something that created jobs and supported a family, and that I had a seat at that table if I wanted it, and he could not understand why I would trade a guaranteed livelihood for what he called, and I remember this exactly because I replayed it for years, a craft fair career. I told him a scholarship covered 40% of tuition and that I planned to apply for additional grants. He said that wasn't the point. I asked him what the point was. He said the point was that he was not going to fund a degree program with no practical application, and if I enrolled in the ceramics program, I would be doing it without his financial support, without the understanding that there was a spot waiting for me in the company, and without the expectation that I could come back and ask for help when the craft fair career didn't pan out the way I was imagining. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He just stated it the way you state terms. Clearly. Completely. With the calm of someone who has already decided the conversation is over. I went to my room. I didn't pack a suitcase that night. I wasn't leaving yet. I had 2 months of high school left, but I sat on my bed and I opened the envelope my grandfather had given me at orientation. Except I realized, sitting there, that I had misremembered. He hadn't given it to me at orientation. He had pressed it into my hand the previous Thanksgiving, while we were washing dishes together, and he'd said, "When you're ready, Sloane," not before. My grandfather's name was Earl. He had worked with his hands his entire life and had a very clear sense of what hands were for. The note inside the envelope was short. It said, "First Tennessee Bank, Highland Avenue branch, account in your name. Password is the name of my first dog. I've been watching you throw clay in that garage for 2 years. Don't let anybody tell you the work in your hands isn't real work. Grandpa Earl." I sat with that piece of paper for a long time. Then I called my grandfather, who was 73 and living 40 minutes away in Maryville, and asked him about the account. He told me he had opened it when I was 16. He said he'd been adding to it every month since. He said he had never mentioned it because he didn't want it to be a reason I made a decision. He wanted it to be a cushion under a decision I had already made for the right reasons. The balance, when I checked it the following week, was $11,400. I enrolled in the ceramics program at UT that fall. I did not ask my father for a single dollar. I covered the gap between the scholarship and my tuition with a combination of my grandfather's savings, 2 part-time jobs, one at a coffee shop on Cumberland Avenue, and one as a studio assistant cleaning equipment and loading kilns for the ceramics department, and a small additional grant I applied for twice before I got it. My apartment was a studio off campus that was technically described as a 1-bedroom, but the bedroom was a lofted platform above the main room, accessible by a ladder that I hit my head on every morning for 2 years. I ate a lot of rice and whatever the coffee shop didn't sell by closing. I was not comfortable. I was also, for the first time in my life, exactly where I was supposed to be. My ceramics professor in my second year was a woman who had shown work in galleries in Asheville, Chicago, and twice in New York. She had the particular patience of someone who had watched a lot of talented people waste their talent being timid. She told me in October of my sophomore year that my work was technically controlled but emotionally closed. She said it not unkindly. She said the pieces were correct, and correct was a ceiling. I stayed after class that day and threw until my arms ached, and something in the clay finally opened up the way she meant. I never forgot that. By my junior year, I had a small reputation within the department. I began selling at the Market Square Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, a folding table, a white tablecloth, and whatever I'd made that week packed in dish towels inside milk crates. The first Saturday, I sold $43 worth of work. I drove home and sat in my car outside my apartment building and cried for about 10 minutes. And I am not entirely sure whether it was because $43 felt like nothing or because someone had touched a piece I made and decided it was worth taking home, and I couldn't fully separate those two feelings. By the end of that year, I had a small waiting list for custom pieces. I graduated with honors. My grandfather drove to Knoxville for the ceremony. He sat in the 3rd row and clapped like a man who had been waiting 4 years to do exactly that. My father did not come. My mother came and she sat beside my grandfather, and afterwards she hugged me and said she was proud of me and that she hopes things worked out. She meant it. She was also careful about it, the way people are careful when they're managing 2 different loyalties at the same time. My brother texted me a gif of confetti popping. We had always gotten along better in text than in person. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, the following September. I had done enough research to know that Asheville had a density of working studio artists, a strong tourism economy that supported craft retail, and a culture that treated handmade objects not as a niche indulgence but as a baseline expectation. I signed a lease on the small studio space in the River Arts District, a room that had previously been part of a metal fabrication shop and still smelled faintly of welding flux no matter how many times I cleaned it. I loved it without reservation. I set up my wheel and my small test kiln. I built shelving from pine boards and metal brackets. I started from scratch the way you start from scratch, slowly, without looking at the whole distance, just the next foot of ground. I named the studio Ironweed Ceramics, after the Tennessee wildflower that blooms purple in fields people have stopped tending. I liked what that suggested, something persistent and a little stubborn, growing in the places people had given up on. My first year in Asheville, I barely broke even. My second year, I was featured in a regional design publication, a small piece, one photo, half a page, but the phone inquiries that followed it were not small. By my third year, Ironweed had a wholesale account with 2 home goods boutiques in Asheville and 1 in Charleston, a steady custom order pipeline, and a waiting list for my signature collection that ran 6 to 8 weeks out. I kept my public profile minimal. I didn't document my personal life. I gave interviews only about process, the clay bodies I worked with, the firing methods, the glaze chemistry. Reporters wanted to talk about the aesthetic. I kept redirecting them to the physics. The physics were more interesting and more honest. My father heard about it eventually. The design world in the Southeast is not large. Preston called me one evening about 18 months after I moved to Asheville and said that Dad had seen the publication piece. Preston said he'd called it a nice little setup. I thanked Preston for calling and went back to the piece I was trimming. Preston and I talked occasionally. He was good at the business. He was also, I thought, quietly tired, in a way he had never acknowledged out loud. But that was not my story to carry. 14 months ago, a man named Douglas Wren walked into my studio on a Tuesday morning. He was wearing a merino crewneck and carrying a leather portfolio, and he had the deliberate unhurriedness of someone accustomed to people adjusting their schedules around his. He introduced himself as the director of brand partnerships for Hearthstone Living, a lifestyle home goods company based in Nashville, with distribution through 42 Williams-Sonoma home locations across the country and a flagship e-commerce platform with over 1 million active subscribers. He said their creative director had been following my work for 8 months. He said Hearthstone had been looking for a signature ceramics partnership to anchor a new collection, something with genuine craft provenance, not manufactured authenticity. He used the phrase genuine craft provenance with the self-awareness of someone who knew it was a complicated sentence but meant it anyway. He placed a partnership proposal on my work table. The terms were a 2-year exclusive wholesale collaboration. Hearthstone would produce a co-branded collection under the Ironweed name, manufactured in the United States, with my involvement in design approval at every stage. The initial contract value was $620,000, with performance-based extensions built in. They wanted to tell the story, the studio, the process, the origin. They wanted me to be visible. They wanted the work and the person behind it in the same frame. I read the proposal twice while Douglas waited, which he did without impatience, looking at the pieces on my shelves with what appeared to be genuine attention. I told him I needed a week to review it with my attorney. He told me to take 10 days. He bought a small bud vase on his way out, the pale celadon one with the uneven lip I'd been meaning to remark. That evening, I was sitting at my work table reviewing the contract terms when my phone rang. Tennessee area code. A number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. It was my father. He did not begin with pleasantries. He never did. He opened the way. He opened every conversation he considered a business matter, with the assumption that his framing of the situation was the correct one and that we were both working from that shared understanding. He told me he had heard about the Hearthstone proposal. The craft and design industry in the Southeast is connected in ways that are easy to underestimate. He told me he was calling with an idea. Callaway Custom Tile and Stone had been facing headwinds. The luxury residential construction market in Knoxville had softened. Two of his longest-standing contractor relationships had retired, and their successors brought their own preferred vendors. Preston was managing the operational side, but the revenue picture was contracting for the first time in 15 years. His proposal was organised. He wanted Ironweed Ceramics to fold into the Callaway brand as a design subsidiary. He would provide fabrication infrastructure. He had a facility, equipment, relationships with material suppliers I didn't have access to. He would provide his existing contractor network and the Callaway name, which, he said, carried decades of trust in the regional construction market. In exchange, he wanted a controlling interest in Ironweed, 49%, and production moved to the Callaway facility in Knoxville. He called it a natural integration. He said the timing was right. He said family enterprises were most resilient when they operated as unified structures. He said it was the smart move. He sounded very much like a man who had not considered that I might disagree. I told him I would think about it. That was not true. But I needed the space between that moment and my actual answer to be sure the answer came from clarity, rather than the specific kind of anger I had been storing carefully in a back room of myself for 7 years. The following morning, I drove to the Blue Ridge Parkway overlook, a go-to when I need to think without clay dust in my lungs and the weight of the current week's orders on my peripheral vision. I sat on the hood of my car and watched the November light come over the ridge. It came slowly the way light does when there's weather behind it. Grey, and then gold, and then grey again. I thought about my grandfather's handwriting on that note, the name of his first dog, a beagle named Pepper, which I had known since I was 6 years old and which I had given to the bank teller without any hesitation. I thought about the welding flux smell in my first Asheville studio, the way the first winter felt like proof I had miscalculated everything, and the way I made the work anyway. I thought about $43 and the crying I did in my car afterward, and how neither of the feelings I couldn't separate had been regret. I drove back to the studio. I called my attorney. I signed the Hearthstone contract. I called my father that afternoon. I told him I was declining the proposal. I told him I understood the business was navigating a difficult period and that I genuinely hoped things stabilized. I told him I held no interest in a prolonged conflict and no appetite for old grievances dressed up as new conversations. Then I told him the truth. I told him that when I was 17 years old, he told me my work had no practical application and that he would not support a craft fair career. I told him I understood now that he said that because he believed it. I understood that he had spent his life building something real with his hands, and that he could not see at the time that I was trying to do the same thing. I did not hold that against him the way I used to. But I told him that Ironweed Ceramics was not a subsidiary of anything. It had been built from a second-hand wheel in a garage, and $11,000 my grandfather had saved quietly without announcement, because he believed in the work before the work had proven itself. It had been built by showing up at Market Square in the cold and driving home with $43 and doing it again the following week. It carried the fingerprints, literal fingerprints, in the clay of every decision I had made without a safety net, and it was not available for integration. I told him I was not interested in the Callaway name. I had built my own. There was a long silence on the line. Then my father said quietly that my grandfather always thought I was the one who would do something he didn't see coming. He said it without ornament. He said it the way men of his generation sometimes say the truest thing they have, sideways, briefly, as if they're not sure they meant to say it at all. I told him Grandpa Earl was right. I said goodbye. I was not cold, I was complete. The Hearthstone collection launched the following spring under the Ironweed name. The first run sold through in 11 days. Hearthstone extended the partnership. I hired 2 studio assistants, one fresh out of the ceramics program at Warren Wilson College, one a former middle school art teacher who had been throwing on her own for 6 years and needed somewhere to go with it. I started paying them what the work deserved, not what I could barely manage. My attorney, who had also become something close to a friend over the previous 2 years, asked me once whether I had any regrets about how things ended with my father. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I told her that I respected what he had built. I still do. 23 employees and a reputation built on 20 years of work. That is not nothing. That is something a person can be proud of. I never stopped understanding that. But he confused the lesson with the inheritance. He thought the thing he was passing down was the business. What he was actually trying to pass down, underneath all of it, was the proof that hard work compounds. That if you show up every day and do the thing that is difficult, something accumulates. He just couldn't see that the lesson applied to me too. In a garage in Knoxville with a second-hand wheel and clay I bought with birthday money. On my work table now, between the stack of current orders and the glaze test tiles from last week's firing, sits a small ceramic cup. It's the first piece I made on that second-hand wheel, lopsided, with a handle that's slightly too high and a base that wobbles on flat surfaces. I kept it because my professor told me to always keep the first real thing. She said you'd need it later to remember what it felt like before you knew what you were doing. I kept it. I look at it most mornings. My grandfather came to Asheville for the Halfstone launch event. He was 76 by then and he moved a little slower than he used to, but he stood in my studio for 2 hours talking to people about clay body composition with the focused attention of a man who finds everything interesting when it's made by hand. At the end of the night, he held the lopsided cup and turned it over carefully the way he used to turn over the furniture joints he'd made to check the fit. He said, "Load-bearing." I knew exactly what he meant. If you have ever been told that the work in your hands wasn't real work, that what you were building was a hobby, a phase, a detour from something more sensible, I want you to hear this clearly, from someone who was told exactly that by someone who loved her and was completely wrong. The work is real. The accumulation is real. The foundation you build from your own conviction, in the hours no one is watching, in the studio that smells like someone else's work, for $43 on a cold Saturday morning. That is the only foundation that cannot be negotiated away, because you are in it. You are the load-bearing wall. Keep throwing. I think about the lopsided cup on my work table a lot, not because it's good. It isn't, not technically, but because it's honest. It's what my hands knew how to make before I had enough reps to know better, and there's something in that I've had to keep returning to. The beginning of something real always looks like proof that you shouldn't have started. What happened between my father and me didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of years of a specific pattern. He built something with his hands. He decided that was the shape that effort took, and then he looked at what I was doing and couldn't find that shape in it. That's not cruelty. That's a failure of imagination, and I say that without contempt, because I've had my own failures of imagination and they've cost me too. But here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect, not in any abstract way, just watching how things actually unfold over time. When you make decisions from integrity, meaning you choose the path that aligns with what you actually are, rather than what's convenient or expected, those decisions compound, not immediately, not visibly, but they do. I left home at 18 without my father's blessing and without a safety net beyond $11,000 my grandfather had saved quietly for 2 years, and I took that money seriously because it wasn't comfort money. It was someone else's belief expressed in the most concrete way a person can express belief. I tried to deserve it every day. And that's the part that I think gets overlooked when people tell the story of someone who made it against the odds. The sheer volume of days where you had to choose to be disciplined when nothing was confirming that discipline was working. The Market Square Saturday where I made $43 and drove home and cried, and then set my alarm for the following Saturday. The first Asheville winter when the orders were thin and the studio was cold, and I kept throwing anyway, not out of bravado but because stopping felt like a betrayal of every decision that had gotten me to that wheel. That persistence, not the dramatic kind, not the kind people photograph, just the ordinary daily kind, is what actually builds something. It accumulates the way my grandfather's deposits accumulated, quietly, without announcement. My professor told me once that the work would only open up when I stopped being careful and started being honest. I think that's true of more than ceramics. The most important thing I learned in that studio in Asheville wasn't a glaze formula or a firing schedule. It was that intelligence without the willingness to be wrong is just performance. I had to be willing to make a bad piece in order to find out what a good one required. I had to be wrong in public, at a folding table at a farmer's market, for people to touch my work and put it back and walk away. That's not a comfortable education. It's the only one that worked. When my father called asking for 49%, he wasn't being malicious. He was applying the same logic he'd always applied, that family businesses should function as unified structures, that his infrastructure could accelerate my growth. He wasn't wrong about the infrastructure. He was wrong about what Ironweed was. It wasn't a growth stage asset waiting for the right distribution partner. It was a record of choices made in the right order, for the right reasons, and that record doesn't transfer. You can't acquire someone's foundation. You can't acquire someone's foundation. You can only build your own. I don't carry resentment about any of it. What I carry is the cup, and Grandpa Earl saying load-bearing like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It was.